I would like to discuss Black Lives Matter and the movement and where the movement, I think, has to go. I think it's a critical step that needs to take place, and it needs to take place almost immediately, because right now is where there's a dimension, a bubble, a window, a advantage from the standpoint of force and from the standpoint of time that can be exploited in order to get political concessions, or at the very least attempt to, as opposed to the protests, which at some point need to come to some crescendo in regards to what it wants to accomplish and how it's going to go about accomplishing those items. And my point is that that needs to be done by turning into the political arena and asserting and separating itself, distinguishing itself from the Democratic Party. Let's be clear about something. Black Lives Matter, from the standpoint of what the saying represents, is not a black utopia of sorts. So it's not this thing where a black domination scheme. Ultimately, it's the opposite of that. It's born out of some level of insecurity. Some group that you have in your society believes, whether right or wrong, that their lives matter less. And under normal circumstances, their lives will be assumed to be mattering as much as anybody else. But the very fact that the words have to be uttered, my life matters, means that they are seeing a deficit in somewhere, in some case. And it seems like the society itself, in our case, also saw that deficit and responded to that with a rather seismic change in regards to race relations, or the way we talk about that stuff. It was a hegemonic shift, meaning that stuff shifted within the context of like a month, or for that matter, 2 months. And it done so in somewhat of a heady way. Seeing George Floyd get murdered, basically a man kneeling on another man's neck for nearly 9 minutes, casually doing so, confident in what he was doing, basically committing a murder. The thing is, as the public viewed and saw that, they were shocked and stunned by that the fact that that could take place at all. And credence was given to the things that African Americans say in regards to our lives and those lives, or the assertion that those lives matter. When you see a man get chased down as he's jogging through a neighborhood, and chased down and murdered, where one of the people who were with him, family member, takes a picture of the dead body as it laid bleeding in the sun and put it on Snapchat. There's something wrong with that. When you have a woman sleeping in her home and cops barge in with a no-knock warrant, guns blazing, there's a problem with that. When you have cops shooting through windows, when you have people being murdered with shot in the back, not a gun, there seems to be a problem with that. You have something like that is going on for years, but with the advent of video and everything else, you have more of those cases that basically come to the limelight. The fascinating thing about this is cops kill 1,000 people a year. 99% of those cops are not charged with anything. And more importantly, even the 1% that do get charged, only a fraction of that see jail. Meaning year after year after year, that was taking place. Blacks only make up 13% of the population, even a disproportionate number. You may get to 24%, maybe 25% at the most. The majority of those people are still white. And yet, that doesn't seem to strike the case. What are the objectives? To be shot and killed to the degree that whites are shot and killed by cops? Is that really a worthy objective at all? Should we just be trying to lower the number of people who are going to be injured and killed in the first place? Just a very basic point. My argument had been that defund the police was too diminutive for all of the energy that's been expended in the United States and across the world. And fact of the matter is the protests continue now. If you do a search, you will find multiple clashes between police and protesters going all across the United States right now as we speak. The more important point that I'm trying to point out, though, is that Black Lives Matter has more to do with a certain perceived insecurity, a deficiency, that it needed to be uttered that our lives have value and our lives matter. And the very fact that it needs to be uttered at all gets across that somebody believes that it's not understood equally. And so it needs to be asserted. Like I said, it's pretty strange and pretty heady to be in a society that has this kind of weird shift in the way that it wants to talk about issues of race. Black Lives Matter, I strongly suspect, is an allegory for African Americans in our society. What I mean by that is it's the group is a stand-in, meaning it's hard for maybe the country to get blacks as a whole, but having the group that's a representative of that may actually be somewhat of a focal point. So when you see these numbers of people who are saying, yeah, I approve of BLM as the organization, I think to some degree that's, yeah, we're taking another look at the issues of race and the things that we might have participated in, that it might have come across in a particular way, or things that we weren't paying attention to that we should have been paying attention to because of the way those things affected other people, adversely affected other people in our society. Statues have been basically vandalized and pulled down. New York has basically defunded the cops, I think, by $1 billion. You've had mass numbers of cops who basically left the force. You've also had an uptick of crime. You've had the situation where in Minneapolis, they're reimagining what the police force is going to be. They've taken steps to basically disband the force in that state. This, of course, was the state where the Floyd issue had taken place. And you also have a photo op of people, particularly political actors, who are doing everything in their power to gain some level of relevance and being association, or in some level of association with this movement. Visible optics. When you see stuff like this, and you see Black Lives Matter being painted on the boulevards, and you have Democrats grinning ear to ear standing side by side, it gives an impression, whether it's real or not, that there's an association there based on implicit interaction with one another. I would point out that that is not necessarily something that will be to the betterment of the organization. Right now, it is in the best interest of that organization to come out and separate themselves clearly, straightforwardly, delineated from the Democratic Party as a whole. And in doing so, make it that much more clear that they have their own political identity that is going to fight for the issues of African Americans in the United States. Welcome to the Soapbox. My name is Jamarl Thomas. This is the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, if you dig this content, please like, share, and subscribe. You can always support this content through PayPal or Patreon. Look, I guess my basic point is that the protests are still going on, despite all of the token things and gestures that have been basically thrown out. Aunt Jemima changing her name, the Redskins changing their name. Those things are great, but at the end of the day, those things are token gestures. And the fact that the protests continue get across that those things are indeed token gestures. Not to mention, the two political parties basically gave their own version of an FU to Black Lives Matter. Defund the police was their main call. Joe Biden and Donald Trump wants to give more money to the cops in this situation. And is not even dealing with the bare bones basic issues that you would think that a Democratic president will want to deal with around the issue of marijuana, considering that Democrats overwhelmingly, not to mention the rest of the country, prefer it to be legalized. If the energies of this movement get hijacked and used to get Biden elected, the moment the election is over with, if it is believed that the energies of this movement cannot be tamed and be used for the interests of the party, it will be snuffed out. It will be choked in its bed as it sleeps. With all of these protests that you're seeing all across the United States now, basically fading away from the standpoint of the media's limelight. The media may do that anyway in the way that it's doing now in the wake of the COVID-19 spike, in which case it went back to the issue of COVID-19 with the visibility of the protests diminishing. My hope has sat precariously on a broad back, a fat back of desperation. What I fear greatly is that any level of a movement gets smuggled in interests or working with the party. By the same token, what I hope is that this movement broadens and becomes something separate and distinct from the party itself in a way that it can create energies that weren't necessarily there and present in our political space because they would be acting outside of the political space. Now, what's true? What's bare bones, breath to lungs true? For the last 40 years, you've been told blue no matter who. You've been told you have nowhere else to go, and that is the pragmatic choice to basically choose whatever random Democrat that comes up. Now, associated with this is the fact that Democrats basically took all the money in the world while simultaneously telling you it doesn't matter what we do as long as we are somehow, even if it's just a nanometer, better than the Republican. Blue no matter who. This argument of narrow focus pragmatism, as opposed to realizing that elections don't stop at any singular elections, that those things go on over the course of time, like everything else. And over the course of time, there's a political momentum in your country that goes in a particular direction. And by getting you to believe into this notion of blue no matter who and pay no attention to the random Democrat that's going into that office and the things that they're going to do in that office, and telling you that basically you have to accept this because the Republican is unacceptable, they've got you into this weird finger trap where they continuously get you to look at it in these narrow terms, when really over the course of time, your political space has shifted significantly further and further to the right. All issues of accountability, or all notions of it, has basically been torched under the ideas of blue no matter who, and for that matter, you have nowhere else to go. So much so you end up with a Hillary Clinton and you end up with a Joe Biden, neither of which is within the context of this particular time period and what the public actually wants. We can see what the public actually wanted because we saw Sanders' platform, where we saw the way the public responded to that platform, despite the fact that the public, looking at this through the lens of electability, was more interested in getting rid of Trump. And right now, you have the distillation of the blue no matter who strategy, this notion of no accountability in your political process, where Joe Biden, despite the fact that people are voting for him, the overwhelming majority, to the tune of nearly 70%, are voting for him entirely because his name is not Donald Trump. This is not an affirmative case of what you want to do as a party. This is not an affirmative case for any particular lefty that can get what they wanted accomplished, because what you want in a party can't get accomplished. When Sanders was running in the race and each and every Democrat raised their hand saying we were willing to lose to Donald Trump if it means stopping Sanders, they were willing to rip the nomination out of Sanders' hand if he was holding on to it with more delegates as he went to the convention. All of them said they would do it. Each and every one of them knew that no Sanders supporter would have voted for that candidate after that candidate did that, meaning that candidate was going to lose, and all of them was going to accept the fact that they would have lost if that meant stopping Sanders. That means the argument that you've been given, this blue no matter who stuff, this you have nowhere else to go stuff, when petitioned with the exact same argument, the Democratic Party basically said, yeah, we do have somewhere to go. We can just lose. And we can prevent you from getting access to the party where you can dominate it for a generation in the same way that FDR did. I'm making the point to you that in your interests, this pragmatism, this not pragmatic pragmatism that you have used in order to justify voting for one random hack Democrat after the next, where you cannot make an affirmative case for the person. It was just entirely, this person is not somebody else. That every time that level of accountability, that level of a standard had been broken, that there are effects of those elections that go beyond just the candidates who are in that race. And you must deal and grapple with this notion of whether or not there's something intrinsic to you that is different than them, or if you are just entirely relative. Meaning, if my argument is that I will die on the flag for Medicare for all and for Social Security expansion, I would hold on to my cold, dead hands as I leave this world. Well, that's where I stand, right? And it would be weird to see me take a position that would anyway hinder that particular quality, because that is a standard to which goes unbroken. And if there is somebody who's running for office that is not towing that standard, regardless of the party the person is in, There are certain things that are sacred to which I should not vote for because it weakens that standard and it makes it that much more difficult to try to get the next person who's coming in line to toe that particular line because you were willing to vote for that particular thing. Now, I understand Trump is horrific. And so the notion that Donald Trump may win again is bone rattling in the same way, though, to me, that Biden is bone rattling. I'm just trying to make the very basic point that the Chinese finger trap that you find yourself in, where you're continuously stuck voting for hacks at some point, has to give way. And the only way that gives way is to allow that edifice to break down. Donald Trump is currently our president. We currently have a lot of people that are dead. We have a lot of people who are going to be thrown out of their homes. These are the things that are taking place. And yet, we still, with the Democratic Party, don't have any kind of large affirmative plan to deal with these items. And it's still basically Joe Biden in his basement, assuming you're going to vote for him, understanding that you're not voting for him for any idea of policy that you may want, despite the fact that the people have agreed on a very lefty policy. No, you're purely putting him in office for who he is not, which means that he will be doing things in that office that you are not necessarily going to like, but you wouldn't put him in there for that reason. You could have had somebody else, but this is where we are. Right now, though, Black Lives Matter has space, or let's say a time advantage and a force advantage. Even if there are only 2 people who are working at Black Lives Matter headquarters, if there is such a thing as even Black Lives Matter headquarters, those people have somewhat of a megaphone because the mainstream media is paying attention to them still. And in the mainstream media paying attention to them, it gives them an outsized voice in the things that they want to say, considering they can get on the various news networks through press conferences and whatnot, I would imagine. Potentially. I don't think I'm overestimating their abilities in this case, considering the way that media has responded to these issues. They must come out now and assert an independent political agenda of the Democratic Party and allowing themselves to be a vehicle that goes beyond just the symbolic gestures. Meaning the protests are nice and there's nothing wrong with stopping those. With keeping those going. But there's something to be said for being able to get political objectives accomplished beyond the symbolic. And those political objectives that need to be accomplished should be asserted, especially since you have a presidential election that are coming up. And your distinction from what the Democratic Party is, since it's not backing various policies that you should at the very least want to back, considering your name, if Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Should Matter, and a host of issues, including issues like Medicare for All, where 88% of Democrats support and 70% of the public support, or for that matter, just basically drug laws, where this notion of decriminalizing marijuana, a drug where the drug laws were basically crafted specifically to go after blacks and hippies. Those are things that you can back. Those are real specific policy initiatives that you can back in a way of showing yourself as separate and distinct from the Democratic Party while simultaneously drawing an emphasis to those items at the exact time where a presidential election is taking place. I don't say this because I'm coming at the word of God or a cosmic certain point of view. I'm saying this because in my point of view, I want to get things accomplished. And when there are opportunities and vehicles that potentially can do that, that separate from the political apparatus, I think those things, especially if they believe in what they say they believe in, are apt to try everything in their toolbox, including coming out as a political vehicle in and of itself, in order to basically push the world into the direction that they say they want the world to go. Your moment in this will be fleeting, and your advantage in power or in force will also be fleeting as the media and the narrative changes their point of view. And I'm telling you, after the election is over with, they are going to snuff this issue out. You are going to get a jolt of energy at the end of the month as people start getting thrown out of their houses. That is a very sad way of getting a jolt of energy, but just from a probability standpoint, a percentage of millions of people who are basically tossed out of their homes will rebel against the system to which they find themselves in. And the pathways that have been created based on the protests that have been taking place around the United States allows an easier overcoming of any level of hindrance of potential energy into getting into those protests. Now, keep in mind, the protests and Black Lives Matter are not simultaneous or not the exact same thing. There's a distinction between many of the people that are going out there protesting versus Black Lives Matter as an organization. I mean, after all, some of these people are all white at these protests. But Black Lives Matter gets a lot of credit for it. That kind of gets to my point, though. Their ability and the megaphone to which they have exposure to right now, while all of this is going on, meaning from the standpoint of COVID and from the standpoint of the protests, is at its apex. You will get more people that are coming out. You must be willing to allow it to grow into broader concerns, because those broader concerns are far more appropriate than the specific issue to which you're trying to accomplish. Defunding the police can happen organically if you just basically deal with the fact that you've abandoned those communities over the course of X number of decades. If you deal with that and you take those communities out of the impoverished column, you put them into the column of people who basically have their ends, violence will go down. Not just violence will go down, crime in and of itself will become less incentivized. That's the second side of the argument that nobody was talking about in Congress. And that was part and parcel to my reason for saying that the defund the police argument was too diminutive. It needed to have both sides. It needed to be done in somewhat of an organic way, because there's a logic to having cops. They're basically the poor that's paid to police the other poor. And they are thrown in as a way of holding back the night, because the upper class in the country don't necessarily want to pay for the society to which they exploit. I'll leave this here. Like, share, and subscribe.